In the spring of 1945, with Berlin surrounded and the war already lost, Adolf Hitler walked outside his bunker for the last time. He pinned medals on a row of soldiers defending the city. The youngest of them was 12 years old. The Hitler Youth did not begin as a mass movement. It began as a footnote. In March 1922, 3 years before the SS existed and 11 years before Hitler became Chancellor, the Nazi Party created a small youth wing called the Jugendbund of the NSDAP. It had a few hundred members, mostly the teenage sons of existing Nazi Party men. It met irregularly. It had no national structure. It was, by every measure, an insignificant organization in an insignificant fringe political party. Then in 1923, the failed beer hall putsch landed Hitler in prison and the Nazi Party was banned. The Jugendbund was dissolved along with it. When the Nazi Party was re-legalized in 1925, Hitler ordered the youth wing reconstituted under a new name. The man chosen to lead it was a 24-year-old failed law student named Kurt Gruber. The new organization had a new name as well, one that Hitler approved personally. They called it the Hitlerjugend, which translates to Hitler Youth. For the first 6 years of its existence, the Hitler Youth was tiny. By 1929, it had only 13,000 members in a Germany of 64 million people. Most German parents in the Weimar Republic had never heard of it. Most German teenagers had no interest in joining. Then in 1931, Hitler appointed a new leader. A 24-year-old former student activist named Baldur von Schirach. That decision changed German childhood for the next 14 years. Baldur von Schirach was, by every account, an unlikely choice to run a youth movement. He was the son of an aristocratic theater director, half American on his mother's side, fluent in English, and had spent his university years writing romantic poetry. He looked nothing like the burly stormtrooper image the Nazi Party usually projected. But Schirach had two qualities Hitler valued. He was personally devoted to Hitler with an almost religious intensity, and he understood how to build a movement out of teenagers. When Schirach took over the Hitler Youth in October 1931, the organization had about 26,000 members. Within 2 years, it had grown to over 2 million. He achieved this growth through 3 strategies. The first was absorption. As soon as Hitler became Chancellor in January 1933, Schirach began aggressively taking over Germany's existing youth organizations. There were hundreds of them, including Catholic youth groups, Protestant youth groups, scouting organizations, sports clubs, and political youth wings of other parties. Schirach pressured them to merge with the Hitler Youth or dissolve. Most chose to dissolve. By the end of 1933, the Hitler Youth had absorbed or eliminated nearly every competing youth organization in Germany except those affiliated with the Catholic Church. The second strategy was legal compulsion. In December 1936, the Nazi government passed the Hitler Youth Law, which declared that all German youth between the ages of 10 and 18 were to be educated in the Hitler Youth. In 1939, a follow-up decree made membership legally mandatory. Parents who tried to keep their children out of the organization could be fined or imprisoned. The third strategy was the most important. Schirach made the Hitler Youth fun. This is the part of the story that most documentaries skip over. The Hitler Youth was not just a propaganda factory. It was, for millions of German children, the most exciting thing that had ever happened to them. To understand the Hitler Youth, you have to understand what it offered. For a working-class German child in the 1930s, daily life was bleak. The Great Depression had devastated the German economy. Unemployment had peaked at 30%. Many families could not afford vacations, sports equipment, musical instruments, or any organized activities for their children. The Hitler Youth offered all of these things for free. Boys received uniforms, badges, knives, and military-style training in shooting, hiking, and orienteering. They went on weekend camping trips, summer camps, and cross-country marches. They received free musical instruction, learned to fly gliders, build model airplanes, and competed in nationwide sporting events. The organization had its own radio programs, its own magazines, its own bands, and its own film studio. Girls had a parallel organization called the Bund Deutscher Mädel, the League of German Girls, which offered similar activities adapted to what the Nazis considered female interests. Hiking trips, folk dancing, singing competitions, cooking and homemaking classes, athletic programs that, for many girls, were the first opportunity they had ever been given to participate in organized sports. Both organizations gave German children something even more valuable than activities. They gave them status. A German boy in a Hitler Youth uniform could speak with authority to adults. He could enforce rules. He could report misconduct. He was, at age 14, a recognized member of the new German order, more important in many ways than his parents. For boys whose fathers were unemployed or absent, this was intoxicating. The Hitler Youth knew exactly what it was offering. Schirach himself, in his memoirs, admitted that the organization succeeded because it gave teenagers what every teenager wants: adventure, belonging, power over adults. The ideology came packaged with the fun, and most members did not separate the two. By the time a German child realized what they had been taught, they had been a member of the Hitler Youth for years. The Hitler Youth curriculum was carefully designed to produce a specific kind of human being. The first lesson was racial. From age 10 onward, members were taught that Germans belonged to a superior Aryan race that was locked in a permanent biological struggle with inferior races, particularly Jews. Hitler Youth songbooks contained lyrics about Jewish blood flowing from knives. Hitler Youth magazines featured anti-Semitic caricatures. Hitler Youth field trips included visits to anti-Jewish exhibitions where children were taught to identify Jewish facial features. The second lesson was political. Members were taught that democracy was weakness, that political parties were corruption, and that strong leaders were the only legitimate form of government. They were taught that Germany had been betrayed in World War I by Jews, communists, and Democrats, the so-called stab-in-the-back myth. They were taught that Adolf Hitler was the savior who would restore German greatness. The third lesson was the most psychologically powerful. Hitler Youth members were taught that loyalty to the Führer came before loyalty to family. This was not implied. It was stated explicitly. In Hitler Youth meetings, leaders openly told members that if their parents criticized Hitler, listened to foreign radio broadcasts, or made jokes about the Nazi Party, the children's first duty was to report him to authorities. A famous Nazi propaganda poster from the period showed a teenage boy in Hitler Youth uniform standing tall while his small, gray-haired father stood behind him, with the slogan, "Youth serves the Führer." Historians have documented thousands of cases in which Hitler Youth members denounced their own parents to the Gestapo. Most resulted in the parents receiving warnings or short sentences. Some resulted in concentration camp commitments. A small number resulted in execution. The most extreme cases involved children turning in fathers who had served as soldiers in World War I and made critical comments about Hitler at home. In several documented instances, fathers were sent to concentration camps based on testimony from sons who were 11 or 12 years old. The fourth lesson was military preparation. From age 14, boys in the Hitler Youth received what was officially called pre-military training. They learned to handle rifles, throw grenades, dig trenches, read maps, and follow military orders. By 1938, this training was so extensive that German army recruits who had been Hitler Youth members were arriving at boot camp already proficient in basic infantry skills. This was the Hitler Youth's most important function from Hitler's perspective. It was a system for manufacturing soldiers. By 1939, the Hitler Youth was the largest youth organization in human history. It had 8.7 million members, which was approximately 90% of all German children between 10 and 18. The organization was divided into 4 age-graded subgroups. For boys aged 10 to 14, there was the Deutsches Jungvolk, the German young people. They wore short pants, brown shirts, and black neckerchiefs. Their activities focused on outdoor skills, basic athletics, and ideological indoctrination. They were taught to memorize Nazi songs, recite the Hitler Youth Oath, and identify enemies of the state. For boys aged 14 to 18, there was the Hitler Youth proper. They wore the same brown shirts but with long pants and the distinctive black leather sword belts. Their training became increasingly military. They participated in shooting competitions, paramilitary exercises, and what the Nazis called character formation, which mostly meant exposure to physical hardship designed to produce obedience and toughness. For girls aged 10 to 14, there was the Jungmädelsbund, the Young Girls League. They wore white blouses, dark skirts, and black neckerchiefs. Their activities emphasized domestic skills, motherhood preparation, racial purity, and ideological loyalty. For girls aged 14 to 18, there was the Bund Deutscher Mädel, the League of German Girls. They received expanded training in homemaking, child rearing, and Nazi racial doctrine. A select subset, called the Glaube und Schönheit, Faith and Beauty, took elite girls aged 17 to 21 and trained them as future wives of SS officers. By the late 1930s, the Hitler Youth had its own court system, its own police force, its own training academies, and its own elite leadership schools called Adolf Hitler schools, which were designed to produce the future leaders of the Nazi state. This is the part of the story that historians find most disturbing. The Hitler Youth was not an extracurricular activity. It was a parallel state, embedded inside the German government, designed to raise an entire generation of Germans inside a closed ideological system from age 10 to adulthood. When the war began in September 1939, the Hitler Youth's role changed almost immediately. For older members, the organization became a feeder system for the German military. Boys who turned 18 were funneled directly into the Wehrmacht, the SS, or the Luftwaffe. Many of them volunteered specifically for the Waffen-SS, which had become a high-status career path among ideologically committed Hitler Youth members. By 1944, Waffen-SS units recruited from Hitler Youth populations were among the most effective combat formations in the German military, and also among the most brutal. In 1943, with German manpower running out, Hitler approved the creation of an entire new Waffen-SS division composed exclusively of Hitler Youth volunteers. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend was filled with 17-year-old boys, many of whom had never shaved. It was deployed against the Allies during the Normandy landings in June 1944. The 12th SS Panzer Division fought with a fanaticism that shocked even hardened Allied soldiers. Surrendering rather than dying was considered a betrayal of the Führer. Casualty rates were catastrophic. Within 6 weeks of the Normandy landings, the division had lost over 60% of its men. By the end of the Battle of Normandy, more than 4,000 of these teenage soldiers had been killed. The division also committed war crimes. At a farm called the Abbaye d'Ardenne in June 1944, members of the Hitlerjugend division executed 20 Canadian prisoners of war. Other massacres of Allied prisoners followed throughout the Normandy campaign. The commanding officer responsible, Kurt Meyer, was tried after the war and sentenced to death, though his sentence was eventually commuted. For younger Hitler Youth members who were not yet old enough for the regular military, the war meant new responsibilities. Boys aged 15 and 16 were assigned to anti-aircraft batteries defending German cities. They operated searchlights, manned anti-aircraft guns, and performed civil defense duties during Allied bombing raids. By 1944, an estimated 200,000 German teenagers were serving in these auxiliary military roles. Girls in the League of German Girls were assigned to agricultural labor, hospital work, and care for children who had been evacuated from bombed German cities. Many were sent east, into occupied Poland, to assist with the German colonization of conquered territories. Some served in administrative roles at concentration camps, though their numbers in these positions remained small. By 1944, the line between the Hitler Youth and active military service had effectively disappeared. In the final year of the war, as the German army collapsed on every front, the Nazi regime turned to its youngest members as a last line of defense. In September 1944, Hitler ordered the creation of the Volkssturm, a national militia composed of every able-bodied German male between the ages of 16 and 60 who was not already in military service. In practice, this meant that most Volkssturm units were filled with elderly men and Hitler Youth boys, often as young as 14. These units were given outdated rifles, minimal training, and impossible orders. They were told to defend German cities against Soviet tanks with weapons that were sometimes from World War I. Casualties were catastrophic. Most Volkssturm units disintegrated within hours of their first contact with Allied forces. In April 1945, with Berlin surrounded by the Red Army, the German government deployed thousands of Hitler Youth boys as defenders of the city. They were issued Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons and ordered to ambush Soviet armor in the streets. Many of them died on their first attempt. Soviet veterans who took Berlin recorded encountering teenage prisoners in tears, terrified and confused, who could not understand why the war was still being fought. On April 20, 1945, 10 days before he killed himself, Hitler made his last public appearance. He walked outside the bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery to award medals to a row of soldiers who had distinguished themselves in the defense of Berlin. The recipients were Hitler Youth members. The youngest, a boy named Alfred Czech, was 12 years old. A photograph of the moment exists. Hitler appears stooped and visibly ill. The boys appear small and exhausted. It is one of the most disturbing images of the Second World War. A few of those boys survived the war. Most did not. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, the Hitler Youth ceased to exist as a formal organization. There was no formal dissolution ceremony. There was no transition plan. The leadership simply scattered. Baldur von Schirach, who had been replaced as head of the Hitler Youth in 1940 to take a position as Nazi governor of Vienna, surrendered to American forces and was tried at Nuremberg. He was sentenced to 20 years in Spandau prison for crimes related to the deportation of Vienna's Jews. He served his full sentence, was released in 1966, and lived quietly in West Germany until his death in 1974. His successor, Arthur Axmann, who had run the Hitler Youth from 1940 until the end of the war, escaped from Berlin and lived in hiding for several months before being captured. He was sentenced to 3 years and 3 months in prison. He spent the rest of his life as a businessman in West Germany, denying any responsibility for the deaths of the teenage boys he had sent into combat. He died in 1996 at the age of 83. For the millions of former Hitler Youth members, the post-war period was disorienting in ways that had no parallel in any other defeated population. They had been taught from age 10 that Adolf Hitler was the savior of Germany, that Jews were subhuman, that democracy was a Jewish conspiracy, and that dying for the Führer was the highest possible honor. They woke up in 1945 and discovered that everything they had been taught was a lie. The Allied occupation authorities understood this problem. The American, British, and French occupation zones implemented a program called denazification, which included re-education programs specifically targeted at former Hitler Youth members. Schools were rebuilt with new curricula. Textbooks were rewritten. Former Nazi teachers were dismissed. The results were mixed. Many former Hitler Youth members rebuilt their lives as functioning members of post-war German democracy. Some became prominent figures in West German politics, business, and culture. Others, particularly those who had served in the Waffen-SS, joined veterans organizations that spent the next several decades arguing that their wartime service had been honorable. A small minority refused to ever accept that the Nazi cause had been wrong. Some of these became the founders of West German neo-Nazi movements, which still exist today. The most important and most uncomfortable question about the Hitler Youth is not what it did during the war. It is what it produced afterward. By 1945, an entire generation of Germans had been raised inside the Hitler Youth system. Anyone born between 1922 and 1935 had spent their entire formative years inside a closed ideological environment that taught racial hatred, authoritarianism, and obedience to Adolf Hitler. The total number of people who had passed through the Hitler Youth system was approximately 10 million. These people did not disappear in 1945. They became the construction workers, factory managers, school teachers, civil servants, police officers, journalists, and politicians of post-war Germany. They raised the next generation of German children. They shaped post-war German political culture in ways that are still being debated by historians today. The German concept of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, which translates roughly to coming to terms with the past, emerged largely as an attempt to address this problem. From the 1960s onward, West German schools began teaching detailed, unflinching accounts of the Nazi period. The German government implemented official memory policies designed to ensure that the Holocaust and the Hitler Youth's role in producing it would never be forgotten. These efforts have been more successful than many critics anticipated. Modern Germany is, by most measures, one of the most self-critical societies in the world when it comes to confronting its own history. The Holocaust is taught in every German school. Concentration camps are preserved as memorial sites. Public denial of the Holocaust is illegal. But the deeper question remains. The Hitler Youth proved that an entire generation of children could be radicalized through state-controlled education in less than a decade. The institution is gone. The lesson it teaches about how easily children can be turned against their own families, their own neighbors, and their own moral instincts is permanent. The Hitler Youth was not a side project of the Nazi regime. It was the regime's long-term plan. Adolf Hitler did not believe that adults could be fully transformed into the kind of human beings the Nazi state required. He believed that adults were already too fixed in their thinking, too attached to old loyalties, too contaminated by pre-Nazi values. The Nazi vision of Germany could only be fully realized through children who had been raised inside the system from the beginning. The Hitler Youth was the laboratory where that vision was tested. It produced soldiers willing to die at 12, informants willing to betray their parents at 10, and an entire generation of Germans who had to be psychologically rebuilt after 1945. It also produced one of the clearest warnings in modern history about what happens when a state takes control of childhood. That is the entire history of the Hitler Youth. If you found this video valuable, consider subscribing for more deep dive history content. The next entry in this series covers Operation Barbarossa, the largest military operation in human history and the moment Nazi Germany sealed its own destruction. You will not want to miss it. Thank you for watching.